the agenda for today, we're going to focus the first half hour or so on hearing from Ben Rashford and Ann Schrag and Johan Walker on the grassland conversion risk project that was funded a couple of years ago. I'm really looking forward to hearing this presentation, not just because it's a great piece of work, but I think this idea of bringing DU and World Wildlife and the university together to collaboratively tackle a very pressing need was really a way to epitomize what the LCC was all about, this concept of collaborative conservation and bringing different partners together for this common cause. So that will start here in a second as soon as we get Ben back on the phone. After that, we're going to talk a little bit about where we've been in the last month or so since we talked as a technical team, progress on development of the Human Dimensions Project. Again, Larry, I'm glad you could join us. Progress on development of our land use change project and emphasis for our request for proposals. I'm going to talk a little bit about the comments that have come in on the request for proposal of the draft, where we're at with release of that. And then Ashley's going to talk a little bit about the efforts to pull together our annual report for 2013, and as importantly, the effort to kick off the communications work group starting tomorrow. And we'll talk a little bit about some upcoming meetings that relate to the LCC in association with the MAFWA conference in Kansas City at the end of the month. We'll put a capstone on it with Rick telling us a little bit about the steering committee. I know he just came back from a conversation with one of our co-chairs, and I'll be interested to hear if you've got anything that you could tell the group about that conversation as well. And maybe I'll mention the webinars for February, March, April, and May have already filled up. We'll hear from Melanie Murphy next month and her wetland hydro period and climate change project. In March, we're going to hear from Ian Dyson and the landscape patterns environmental quality analysis that was done. April, Natalie Sexton is going to be here to talk about the humandimensions.gov website and her perspectives on the human dimensions work that we're involved in. And May, we're going to hear from Bob Gresswell out in Montana with some of the climate change and fish efforts that Bob and Kathy have been working on for the last 2 or 3 years. With that, I think what I'll do here, Ann, is I'll pass the ball to you. I understand you're going to kick this off, and we'll take it from there. So if you click on the Share My Desktop in the middle of the screen, we'll have you lead off. And if you wouldn't mind, give yourself a little introduction before you start.
Sure. So I'm Ann Schrag. I am the landscape ecologist for the Northern Great Plains program of the World Wildlife Fund. I am recovering from a cold and based in Bozeman, Montana. So this project was basically a collaboration. It's been about 3 years in the making between WWF, Ben Rashford, who's with the University of Wyoming, and Johan Walker, who is with DU. And I was going to zip through these first few slides, so if there's too much of a lag, somebody just let me know and I'll go a little bit slower. So I just want to start off by giving you a little overview of where we work. This is our definition of the Northern Great Plains. It includes the Nebraska Sandhills and goes up into parts of Saskatchewan and Alberta and Canada. For this particular project, we were focused fully on the U.S. portion of the Northern Great Plains, so we didn't look at data for Canada. This is about 80% private land. The rest is federal, tribal, and state. So obviously, as we all know, being involved with the LCC, conversion for cropland is a huge sort of driving land use change, both within our Northern Great Plains ecoregion and the larger PPP LCC landscape. Some of the driving factors for this include crop returns, which are yields and prices, government payments, which include disaster payments and things like crop insurance, and then also climate three main factors that we looked at in the modeling that comprised the majority of this project that Ben will be talking about in a minute. So what WWF did was to look sort of back into the past. We used a similar methodology to the one that was published in the Wright and Wimberly paper that I'm sure most of you are familiar with from 2013. They looked at conversion a little bit east of our ecoregion, so we wanted to look within our ecoregion, the U.S. portion, at conversion of grassland to three of the most common crop types. Those include corn, soybeans, and wheat. So we did this at a 56-meter resolution using the cropland data layer, and we lumped pasture, grassland herbaceous, and hay into one grassland category, similar to the way that Wright and Wimberly did it, and then looked at net change from 2008 to 2012. We used a 560-meter regional smoothing surface to highlight these geographic hotspots of change, which is what you see in this particular map. So areas in warm colors, yellow, orange, and red, indicate a loss of grassland, while areas in cool colors indicate gains in grassland. So all taken, looking at conversion from grassland to corn, we see about 500,000 acres converted to corn from grass between 2008 and 2012. Looking at soybeans, we see a loss of about 177,000 acres. And then finally looking at conversion of grassland to wheat, we see over 1 million acres lost during that time period. And this is the most widely spread throughout the ecoregion, whereas the other two are mostly along the eastern edge of our ecoregion. So now I'm going to advance these slides for Ben, I believe. Ben, are you ready?
Yeah, I'm back. I'm Ben Rashford, for those that don't know me. Like Ann said, I work at the University of Wyoming. I'm an associate professor in agricultural and applied economics. And pretty much for the last 6 or 7 years, I've focused most of my work on issues related to waterfowl. And along with Johan and Ann, this led to examining land use change in the prairies and Great Plains. So this project, and what I'm going to talk about now, is a model looking at essentially the probability of observing cropland versus grassland in the northern Great Plains. And I'm not going to talk a lot about the actual statistical model, but if anyone has questions, I'll certainly answer them. Essentially, it's a standard binary logit model, predicts the probability of observing cropland given observations on economic returns and soil quality, government payments, and climate, those drivers that Ann talked about. And what you're looking at here is essentially the baseline predictions from that model. So this is the probability of observing cropland. And essentially what we notice is that it looks pretty similar to those pictures of change that Ann just showed. Is those areas in the eastern portion of the northern Great Plains and the Dakotas have high probabilities of cropland. And that, of course, matches the areas that have the highest soil quality. And in terms of the way the model sort of performs, you can see that table at the bottom sort of shows that for observations in our data that were grassland, our model predicts a low probability of being cropland and vice versa. It's essentially saying that the model predicts what we observe pretty well. So go ahead to that next slide. So given that the model predicts what we observe pretty well, the nice part about this type of model is we could use it to potentially predict the future. With a lot of caveats, of course. But we looked at a few scenarios. One is just a simple increase in the return to crops. So if we increase crop returns by 10%, for example, it increases the probability of observing cropland on average by about 0.3, or 0.03, so about by 3%. But on high soil quality land, an increase in crop returns increases the probability by up to 10%. So what this picture shows is that change in the probability across space. And the change that you're looking at, essentially if you took the expectation means that we would expect about 55,000 fewer grassland acres in the Northern Great Plains if crop returns increase 10%. Go to the next one. Similar, we also did a bigger 25%. With a 25% increase, we'd expect about 240,000 fewer grassland acres. But one of the important things to note when you look at this map is that even with a 25% increase in crop returns, there's a lot of the Northern Great Plains where the probability of cropland remains low. So this is these lands that are secure, so to speak, have low conversion risk, given that the current crop technologies aren't suitable on those soils or in those climates. So we have a fair portion of the region that's fairly secure, quote unquote, and then that eastern portion, pretty much every grassland acre that's left is at risk of converting to cropland. Go ahead. Yeah, next one. We also, to spice things up a little bit, let me explain this. So the previous slides were just simple percentage increases in crop returns. And, put that in perspective, those 10% and 25% increases are really relatively small on a per acre basis. You're looking at $3 or $6 per acre. But if you look at the trend in crop returns over the previous decade, from the late 90s to 2010, crop returns have increased quite a bit faster than that in places. So we also sort of predicted a linear trend in crop returns. That linear trend implies in some counties that crop returns could increase by as much as 75, and in some places up to 500%. If that actually continued out to 2030, then we could see significantly fewer grassland acres, about 3 million additional cropland acres in this case, or 3 million fewer grassland acres. Yeah, keep going. You recall the model also included the effect of government payments. Government payments in the statistical model included direct government payments less conservation programs. So this is crop insurance and subsidy programs that pretty much focus on cropland. So what we did was consider what if government payments increased, and a government payment increase of 10% increases the probability of observing cropland by, again, about 3% on average, which implies a loss of around 600,000 grassland acres. So if government payments increased in every county by 10%, we would expect 600,000 fewer grassland acres. And at 25%, we'd expect about 1.5 million fewer grassland acres. You'll notice that, most of those losses, if you look at those colors where the red is essentially increasing cropland probability, that higher government payments don't do much in areas with very low soil quality, mostly because counties that have really low average soil quality also have really low government payment rates. So again, it continues to put pressure on those areas where the current soils and climates are appropriate for growing crops. Let's go to the next one. Now, nobody get too excited here. This was sort of a thought exercise where we asked the model, what would the world look like if there were no government payments? So you shouldn't interpret this as how the landscape would change if government payments went away. It's probably a better description of what the landscape might look like had there never been any government payments. So this map is showing us if government payments were zero everywhere, we would expect the Northern Great Plains would have about 5.5 million additional grassland acres. That is 5.5 million acres that are currently cropland wouldn't be if there were no government payments. But this is a stretch for the model because, of course, we're trying to predict quite a bit out of the range of the data that we had. But it's an interesting thought exercise if we could go back in time. And next slide. We also, as Ann pointed out, included climate measures in our probability model, so we were able to predict what the future landscape might be under a variety of climate scenarios. And we did a range of different scenarios, and we see a pretty consistent pattern. On average, the probability of observing cropland decreases with a changing climate by about 1 to 6%. But in certain areas, it increases substantially. So in areas that are predicted to get warmer and wetter, we see an increase in the probability of observing cropland. We would expect fewer grassland acres. Whereas in regions where the climate is predicted to get drier, it is either a lot warmer or not very much wetter, then grassland is relatively stable. So a lot of those regions in Montana, as you see in the map, are relatively stable under alternative climate scenarios. But again, areas to the east, where future climate predictions suggest it'll be warmer and wetter, become even more likely to be cropland. Oh, and one last. We also, use this model to combine everything at once. So, we looked at what about future climate scenarios and an increase in crop returns. Well, this is a scenario that's probably fairly likely. If biofuels scenarios play out, crop prices continue to increase, global demand for commodities continue to drive up crop returns, and we get climate change, what's likely to happen? And the outcome of those sort of exercises kind of follows everything we've said so far. Areas that become less suitable for cropland under climate change, the probability of cropland decreases. So one of the important things to point out when we combine climate change and crop returns is that those regions, for example, a lot of the counties in Montana, where climate is predicted to become much less suitable for crops than it already is, increases in prices aren't sufficient to induce land use change. So even under these future climate and higher crop scenarios, there are lots of regions where grassland is relatively stable. And I think that's mine.
Hey folks, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, this is Johan Walker. For those of you who I haven't met, I work for Ducks Unlimited in Bismarck, and I've had kind of a supporting role in this project for the last few years. And one of the things that Ben and Ann were interested in taking a look at as they've finished up the land use change and climate-related land use change modeling was to take a look at how that might affect wildlife resources in this region. And one very nice data source that's out there is the Fish and Wildlife Service, Canadian Wildlife Service Breeding Pair and Habitat Survey, Waterfowl Breeding Pair and Habitat Survey data that runs from 1955 to the present on segments within this area of interest that they had. And so I took those data from 1971 to 2012, about a 40-year time series, and built a kind of nested hierarchical model to take a look at how might climate change redistribute breeding pairs through this region, and then that allowed us to think a little bit about how breeding pairs might be affected by the land use change predicted by Ben's models. And so I'll kind of step you through what you're looking at here are the ultimate results, but I'll lay out a couple of the sort of ideas behind them and how we got there. So I built a model first that basically took the ponds data, they also count ponds in this survey, and modeled those ponds, the expected number of ponds on a segment each year, as a function of mean annual precipitation and mean annual temperature in the present, kind of the historic record, as well as the interaction of temperature and precipitation to sort of allow an additional dimension there, kind of precipitation evaporation ratio kind of thinking. And so that first model makes a prediction of how many ponds might be in an area based on its precipitation and temperature. The second model then comes in over the top of the first model and predicts how many pairs might be associated with those ponds. So that's the statistical modeling that I did. Then Ben was kind enough to take those models and map them back to the geography that we used under these different climate scenarios in 2030 and 2060, which is what you see on the left and right panels in this map slide. And the rub is that under these climate scenarios that we looked at, about 40% of the ducks in this area settle in the strata in North Dakota, which is basically the upper right of each panel. If you look, you're kind of looking at that center line right below 2030 going down is the border of Montana and North Dakota, and then shifting to the Montana, South Dakota, Wyoming, South Dakota border. So on the left, you're looking at a strata in Montana. On the right top, a strata in North Dakota, and on the right bottom, a strata in South Dakota within each panel. And so what you see is some movement of ducks, the hotter colors, away from the North Dakota strata and into the south and west, mostly to the west. And that constitutes about a 10 to 20% shift. So just to give you a basis here, there's about 1 million ducks on average over that 40 years in those three strata. And those 1 million ducks, about 40% of them are in that North Dakota strata, about 400,000 birds. Under these different climate change scenarios over the next 60 years or so, you wind up with a shift of between 20 and 40% of those ducks, or 20,000. So somewhere between 80,000 and 40,000 birds moving south and west. So a significant proportional change, right? Maybe 1 out of 5 pairs moving into the other strata, and in some ways away from Ben's predicted conversion. But in other respects, a relatively small overall change relative to a breeding population of maybe 35 million ducks in North America. So the way we think about this, or the way I've thought about this in a management context, is, of course, these are long-term projections of fairly simple models, which made sense to us because obviously long-term projections of complicated models might even be more dangerous. But that if birds did shift into some of these areas where conversion was less likely, then the impacts of that conversion on breeding pairs might be ameliorated somewhat, and we might take a stronger look at wetlands in those areas within Montana and South Dakota that are more to the south and the west. With, as Ben pointed out earlier, many caveats. So that's kind of just a way of adding the wildlife dimension back in. I think there's potential to do this same kind of modeling for songbirds and to try out a few different approaches, but that was my piece of it. Thanks.
Okay, I think that's all of it from us, so we can take questions if people have them.
First of all, this is Mike. Thanks, Ben and Ann and Johan, for the great presentation, and I think you each brought some terrific expertise to the problem, and I like the way that it all seemed to come together there at the end with a real-world example. Maybe for anybody on this the call, are folks that try to strategize on where we invest our conservation dollars, beginning to look at some of this modeling and try to be forward-looking in our expenditures? Is anybody using it yet for that purpose?
Who wants to answer that?
I don't know. I'll throw it out to anybody.
Oh.
Any of the three of you or anybody else on the call.
Well, you could probably answer the direct question of, is anybody using it yet? And others on the call. I don't, to my knowledge, no one's using it yet. Perhaps the question is, could we use it? And how could we use it? And I think Johan sort of hinted towards some of the possible management implications. You know, if we believe in these future climate scenarios, and we're going to have more secure grasslands and potentially more ducks, and better conditions for wetlands as well, in some of the strata in Montana, you know, that might suggest a policy of securing large tracts of habitat in those regions where it's likely to be relatively inexpensive, since cropland probabilities aren't high. Opportunity costs of the land might be lower. On the other hand, you know, as Johan pointed out, there's still an awful lot of ducks that are settling in North Dakota and in regions of South Dakota, where every model we've ever run says that cropland is going to increase there. So it raises the question of what do we do in those locations where conserving large tracts of land is going to be very expensive. You have to compete with high opportunity costs. What strategies might we be able to implement that could balance the high cost of securing habitat in those locations against the high risk of losing grassland to cropland? I don't know that I have an answer to that, but I think a bunch of smart folks putting their heads together could start to come up with ideas.
Hey Ben, this is Kevin. I think all those were great points, and I'm, curious to sort of throw it out to the group on thoughts on expanding this a little bit more to the east. Obviously when you start throwing in a species like waterfowl, their populations are a little bit further to the east, and some of the frontline issues for some of the more eastern distributed grassland birds, I could also see them being important as well, because what I took home from this is those high level, if you increase crop insurance by this much, this is the expected return on people from a landscape. Those kind of things can really resonate at a policy level on these are the consequences of our decisions. Right now we're in a farm bill debate, and boy, wouldn't it be nice if we had some of that stuff going on to where the ground zero of grassland losses today. And again, just another, a comment is, it's pretty depressing living in North Dakota, seeing every single model result that you guys did. It seems we're in the bullseye no matter what.
So maybe let's back up just to the front of that set of questions or comments, Kevin, and the question about moving this work to the east, and maybe expanding the work that Wright and Wimberly did with some of this more economic layering and human layering. That's really where we left off in Pierre, and I think that's been the impetus for the development of that piece of next year's push for the LCC project funding. I know Ben and Chris have talked and maybe even integrated some conversations with Larry, who's also on the phone. I've seen some drafts of where they'd like to take this, but I think, Kevin, you're right on the mark there for where the power of this could even be expanded with further movement to the east. Any comments from anybody on the group? Johan, you've been part of that discussion as well.
I'm kind of leaving a little room for Ben to jump in because I think he knows more about the details of expanding that, but I agree that expanding some of this stuff to the east is a logical move, especially from the perspective of folks who are working on waterfowl conservation. We have much larger populations of breeding waterfowl east of the Missouri River and are spending a lot of energy trying to conserve habitat for those populations. So we've talked a bit, and I think Ben could expand a bit. We've seen it as feasible to get into understanding land use change in the eastern part of this PPP LCC region, and possibly, working toward learning about the mechanisms behind that. How do those decisions get made? Not just at the highest levels, like Kevin was associating with policy decisions, but how might we better inform programmatic choices on the ground too, as we select among different conservation opportunities with limited resources. So there's a couple tiers there in that hierarchy, I think, that are of interest to most of us.
Yeah, I think Johan covered that well. Those of you that have seen what we've been thinking about to expand this project, that next branch of research would include modeling land use conversion risk, similar to what we talked about today, but rerunning the whole model for the entire region, not including Canada because the data is different, I'm afraid. But that way we'd have the whole PPR and Northern Great Plains land use risk model. And we've talked a little bit, towards Kevin's point, it can be difficult to try to understand and model the role of broad policies like crop insurance, because those programs are so complicated that the data to model them at a parcel level is limited. But we've been talking about ways to try to do that better, so we'd have a better understanding of how changes in those policies might affect conversion risk. But then also, as Johan said, that's a big picture at the sort of the federal policy level. We also, and I think all of you guys that are in the Dakotas now, recognize that you observe on the ground a lot of parcels that seemingly should be cropland that aren't, and vice versa. And our models sort of have the same problem. They'll predict that an area should all be cropland, yet there's remnants of grassland that remain. And that's Johan's point about drilling down a little deeper to, what can we learn that explains at a land ownership level, explains why some people don't convert even though the economics says they probably should, and vice versa. And that's sort of what we're envisioning moving forward.
Well, that sounds cool. This is Larry, because that's some of the type of questions we're going to get at that if we do the Human Dimensions project.
And I think that's a great statement there, Larry, because one of the things we've been trying to do over the last couple of years is make these types of connections between more than one project and how they can assist in answering a specific question by collaborating versus more of that competitive approaches to research. So thanks for chiming in there. Any other questions for Ann or Johan or Ben?
This is Justin. Are you guys is this gonna be written up into a final report, or is this gonna be a series of report, or what kind of products? Because I'm just thinking here in Montana, it's different than the Dakotas, where maybe things are gonna get better, and maybe we could use this to, in our own habitat conservation programs, in the kind of decisions Johan is talking about. And what we would need is some kind of documentation that folks can look at and consider how they could incorporate it.
Yeah, this is Ben. We have a sort of a final technical report, and I'm not exactly sure, Mike, how available that is yet, or how you plan to make it available. But that'll be out there. And then, I think we also just have as you can tell from these maps, the modeling is at high spatial resolution. So we have an enormous amount of data. And to a certain degree, if you wanted us to, for example, drill down a specific county and show you some results, we could probably do that, given a request in a little bit of time. And we'll also, of course, pursue some academic publications so that you guys can use this work and know that it's been, scientifically validated, but those aren't out yet.
But if I can jump in, and correct me if I'm wrong, Justin, are you looking for maybe some one-on-one time with some of the either the policy folks or the land managers in Montana to help them understand these models and look for their individual applicability for the local problems or issues in Montana?
Yeah, I guess one-on-one time would be the most productive, but I think we would have to start with some kind of written document that I could send out, like to the regional program managers and our habitat chief here, to get them familiar with what the work is and think about how they might incorporate it. And then maybe they could come back to you with some more specific questions like you're talking about, like what about these counties and these sorts of maps.
Well, I think as a start, Justin, maybe where we could take this is we'll post the final technical report on the website, and we'll also have a link to this webinar so they can watch this webinar and see kind of the overview of the project. And then we can, certainly connect them with Ann and Johan and Ben individually if there's specific questions.
And this is Ashley. I just wanted to chime in there too. We do have the report already posted on the website, so I can just shoot out a direct link to you guys if you'd like that as well. The other thing was, I know Ann, you and Ben had been working on a 2 or 3 page kind of synopsis. Is that something that might be of use as well? Just kind of to set the stage, but not the complete actual technical report, something a little bit more easier to digest.
Yeah, and we're pretty close to finishing that up, so it should be just the next couple days.
Perfect.
So this is Rick. So I'm not trying to put Ben or Ann or Johan or anybody else on the spot here, but let me just toss out an idea based upon Justin's question. One of the things that came up at our steering committee meeting in Portland from several steering committee members was the need to do a better job of getting out information. And in the context of non-traditional types of things, perhaps, versus just, what we always do, and we do it well. We do reports, we do peer-reviewed publications. So, and we have to run this by the steering committee, and obviously I want input from everybody on the tech committee too. So here's kind of the example based upon this webinar. Perhaps there's an opportunity if we expand this a little bit, or we build this in. Maybe we do this in the RFP. Maybe we ask Ben and Ann and Johan to take one for the team a little bit here. But is there an opportunity for, if funding is an issue and is available, I know time's always there as well, but maybe part of this is providing some travel assistance to Ben and Ann and Johan to actually go out and meet with some specific groups of managers. Justin sets up a meeting with, some of his folks, for example, and you guys can be available to go out there and sit down with them and interact with them and give this presentation and, one-on-one group type things. I just like us to, we don't have to answer that question today, but I think there's an opportunity to think about this a little differently maybe and facilitate those discussions a little bit more directly.
It'll help us make the link between management and science as well.
Well, yeah, this is Kevin, and I think stuff like that's a great idea. When I saw it, I've been working a lot with Sprague's Pipit and getting a little involved in the whole listing decision on that, and I could see something like the results being really important to decisions that could have pretty big implications for the species and how stuff's managed up there as well. As far as I know, this is one of maybe the first, or if not the first, one of a handful of things that is actually looking at what the grasslands are going to do that, and especially in that Montana area, that's where the bulk of the pipits are remaining. So I think it's really important to get these kind of information in front of the people who make the decisions, because I can pretty much guarantee it. If I wasn't on this call today, I'm not so certain it would find its way into the decision process. But since I am part of this group, I'll certainly put it in front of the right people. But trying to formalize that who's the right people that need to see the results is kind of key to long-term success. Because everyone just gets swamped. Unless it's hand-fed, it's sometimes not used.
So, Kevin, this is Johan. I don't want to put you on the spot too much, but I couldn't help but think as you talked about the importance of that area to Sprague's Pipit that it might be useful to take some of the modeling you guys have done with respect to that and combine it with some of these land use change scenarios. Are you thinking about that at all?
Absolutely. I mean, right now, I think, TNC built a crop suitability model, and, my thoughts were trying to crosswalk those results, because those crop suitability models right now, they seem to be very robust at now in how current capacities are sort of what's getting tilled. They validate very well, but they don't have a future projections, and they don't have the price of cropland and stuff like that into it. So what happens is you end up you have these scenarios that are like, say, okay, if it's less than 0.3 suitability now, then that's a scenario and what it means to the population. But the more those scenarios can get refined to that they reflect, based upon climate change, we actually don't think that threshold is really meaningful in Montana. It's probably more like 0.5 based upon these other characteristics. I think that kind of crosswalk is extremely valuable.
For what it's worth, to answer Rick's question, I'd be willing. I'd certainly travel around and do some smaller group meetings on this project or some of the other related things that we've done.
And I'll just make unauthorized commitment here, because I'm well along in my career and I feel comfortable doing these kinds of things. If it requires some additional funding, I'll just tell you that on behalf of the Fish and Wildlife Service piece of the partnership. I think that Mike and I could come up with some travel money for you guys if that was a limiting factor to build on those, to do some, targeted meetings with folks. So I will make that commitment. We have some what I'll call discretionary funding in part of our budget that we can help out with that. So Johan and Ben, if that indeed is something that you want to pursue further to get this information out, more effectively, and maybe it's the pilot type of a thing we do, we'll commit to helping you we'll find some money to help you do that.
Maybe on that magnanimous gesture, that's a good place to wrap up this. We have a few other things that we want to cover in the last 20 minutes, but I want to end again by thanking Ben and Ann and Johan for working so well on this project and really delivering a product that I think is unique and epitomizes what I think the LCC was envisioning when we started to fund this one in particular a couple of years ago. So thanks again, folks, for the presentation. The Tech Committee, folks, I'd like to go right into this quick discussion of what we've done in the last month or so since we've officially met. We've made a lot of progress on the Human Dimension project to the point that Larry is that he's outlined a very robust piece of work that we've looked at, and because it's going through the USGS and the co-op unit, we have a way to contract that can keep us from having to put that one out through the RFP process. It still will need some steering committee approval and discussion, and right now, Rick, that's, as far as I know, that's the week of the 3rd of February, but I don't know of a specific date yet.
Well, so I was meeting with Kerry Steinman, who's our co-chair, and I think based upon his schedule and what I got from Tom Melius this morning, it looks pretty certain that we're going to meet on the 6th of February, and that'll be a conference call webinar that'll start at 2 o'clock Central Time. And I'm going to confirm that with Tom Melius yet this afternoon, but that's what we're planning on doing for our next steering committee conference call webinar.
And certainly one of the action items that would come out of that meeting would be a discussion about this Human Dimensions topic through the co-op unit and where we believe that'll be going with their support.
And I'll just mention this again, and we talked about this last time, but just to reiterate, because it's an important point. Our steering committee really embraced the idea that you all pitched to them via the work you did in Peer, that there are times, and these projects are, 2 of them, that the steering committee is willing to agree that these are collectively really important things to do, and we may not have to go the standard RFP route. We can find ways to get this work done without just going through grants.gov. Now, we'll still have to do some of that because of contracting rules with federal money and those types of things. But here's an opportunity for us to take us to the next level where indeed we can agree on good things and just move forward with them. So these are 2 that we're going to talk about specifically at the steering committee meeting with that regard.
So just to be clear, the land use change project that's also been fleshed out by Ben and Chris Wright and Larry would be another one that we would take directly to the steering committee for their blessing.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So that still will leave us with a couple of $100,000 for new work. And what I want to talk about is the comments that all of you have provided through the RFP, the draft RFP that I sent around. Here's kind of a summary of some of those comments. That we need to remember the aquatic aspects and integrate that into the request for proposals. There was a recognition that we dropped. One of the things we talked about in Peer is as part of that land use change topic, we also want to make sure that we are synthesizing the existing efforts or the efforts to date so we can be certain that our piece of the next stage fits into what's been done and where the gaps exist. There were a fair number of comments that came in on the draft RFP that they liked this section or that section, but I didn't put all of these in there. In particular, some folks were pretty excited about the idea of the requirement of a communication plan. I think where we ended the discussion with Ben and Ann and Johan is a good reflection of the need for a plan when you finish the project on how are you going to communicate the findings across the network. There was a couple of comments there related to let's try and be even more narrow when it comes to these two topics. Might help us in our review time. But for the most part, I think folks, we appreciate all these constructive comments, but I think the fact that they came in like this and a lot of positive comments is a reflection that we're making progress on our RFP efforts and our proposal piece of this partnership. Any thoughts there, Rick?
Well, just one thing, I guess. So as we talk about these two projects, the Human Dimensions and Land Use Change project, I guess I would ask and encourage everybody to take a good hard look at those again and make sure, because the steering committee is going to ask this question, and I think you guys as tech committee members have huge influence on your steering committee members, obviously, but we want to make sure that as we walk down this new model of how we get work done via the steering committee agreeing on things and kind of internally looking at how we do this, that it works, that it is a collective, collaborative need that's being met. So as you guys individually review these from your own entity's missions, make sure that that fits, because the steering committee members will bring that up. They did it at Portland in talking about the project VLM brought forward. Make sure that it meets your needs and that we can collectively say to ourselves and to our steering committee, yeah, we see this as meeting those collective needs of each individual agency, not one versus the other type of thing. So that'll be an important discussion that'll be asked at the steering committee.
We're working with our grant administrators in Minneapolis to develop the language for the grants.gov announcement. That'll also focus on human dimensions and land use change, as we've mentioned in the draft RFP. We hope to have that out as early as next week on the streets, and we anticipate leaving it open for about a month, say to mid-February. But as I mentioned earlier, even if we were to fund the two projects we've kind of developed to date, that's still going to leave us enough money, I think, on the table to maybe cherry pick two or three really good pieces of work in addition to those next year.
Any questions about the RFP? Or where we're collectively going?
I will send out the new draft to folks that I just sent to Minneapolis today, based on everybody's comments on the draft. I didn't get that out before this call, but I'll send it out as soon as we hang up here. Ashley, how are we coming on our annual report?
Hey, Mike. We're coming along really well. Actually, we're aiming to actually have the report completed by the Midwest Fish and Wildlife Conference on the week of the 27th. I think you were going to be mentioning that as well. But we've got some great feature stories included in the report itself, focusing. Actually, one of them was written by Ann and Ben, focusing on this grassland conversion risk project. Dr. Melanie Murphy as well, wetland hydro period. Of course, Billy Gascoigne's work on rural well-being in the PPR, and Ian Dyson's work as well, focusing on the landscape land.
Did we lose you, Ashley? It's the Landscape Patterns Environmental Quality Analysis. That's what it's titled.
Hey, sorry guys, I hit the mute button. Yes, so we're coming along really well. In addition to the actual report itself, we're going to have a one-page summary, something that's much more easier to digest as well, that could be handed out. So we'll definitely get those into the hands of both the steering committee and the technical committee as soon as we can.
And we'll be hearing details about Melanie's work and Ian's work in the next 2 months on this call.
So this is Rick again. Let me throw out one more thing here about our annual reports. Same thing I just said. When you get this year's annual report, I would ask you to look at it with a critical eye and make sure that it's working for you and for your agency, so that it meets a need that you have in terms of understanding, and so that people that you may hand it out to have a good understanding of what it is we're doing and why we're doing it. And if it isn't, then we have opportunities to make that so, and let's work on that if we need to as well.
Ashley mentioned the upcoming Midwest meeting the last week of the month in January. There just happens to be a number of LCC-related activities that are going on in conjunction with that week. We have a Midwest LCC symposium track as part of the Midwest sessions on Monday from 10 to 2, and Gwen White has really taken the lead on that, and she's done an awesome job of lining up updates from a number of LCCs and some specific projects, including one that we're doing in concert with a number of joint ventures on the high-resolution imagery project. And we're going to also be hearing about the communications network that Ashley is establishing tomorrow for the first time. In addition to that symposium, Max is going to be leading a multi-LCC effort to look at Gulf hypoxia and where LCCs may fit into the problem. And Max, are you still with us?
Yeah.
I'll dare you to summarize what we're going to do in a minute or less.
I've been asked to help facilitate a structured decision-making workshop to try to figure out where the LCC, or what the LCC can do to kind of develop kind of a shared vision of what the landscape is going to look like in terms of impacting both the Gulf hypoxia problem and wildlife conservation.
Not one LCC, but 7.
7 LCCs, yeah.
And obviously we have a piece of that Mississippi River Basin, but it's but one of 7 LCCs that are engaged in this effort. And then in addition to that, there's an all LCC staff meeting that's going to be happening in Kansas City after the Midwest adjourns for the last half of that week, where we're going to try and do what we can from a network perspective to see if there's opportunities to knit some of this science together between the 22 LCCs, and I think that's a huge ongoing challenge for us, but one that we're going to tackle at least to the next step here in a couple weeks. Ashley, any other communications updates, or do you want to remind folks about the call tomorrow?
Sure, I can just expand a little bit on that. We've been talking about the development of the Midwest Communications Network for quite a while now, and we're actually hosting our first webinar meeting tomorrow. We've got about 40 folks signed up, specifically public affairs specialists and communication managers, stretching all the way from the Dakotas across to Pennsylvania. So it's quite a big group of folks. Essentially we're going to be bringing these individuals together to set the foundation for really a collaborative approach to natural resource communications. And to my knowledge, it's never been done before, but we're very excited about it. It's going to be a great opportunity for a lot of my colleagues to talk and meet each other for the first time, and really to connect some great expertise that we have across the region, and start to coordinate on some of the messaging and stakeholders that we have. We can really capitalize and augment and leverage the resources of our agencies. So we're very excited about that. If folks have any questions, let me know. I'm definitely going to report back out to you guys after the meeting, probably now on next month's webinar, just to let folks know what the outcomes were from our first initial meeting.
Thanks, Ashley. You're doing a great job, and we're lucky to have you. Rick, anything else you want to mention relative to the upcoming steering committee meeting? Well, and maybe the tech committee's role in keeping those folks involved?
Yeah, I guess I, again, would encourage you, it's a steering committee meeting, but as your steering committee members feel comfortable or will allow you, or whatever the terminology is, get on the phone and listen in. We had a really good meeting in Portland. I'll just tell you from my perspective, it was the best steering committee meeting we had, because they actually got engaged and had really good discussions along the lines that we've all been hoping they would have. So I think this next meeting is going to build upon that, and I guess I would encourage you all to sit in on that call and participate.
If it truly does happen on February 6th, that's a Friday, we would be meeting 2 days before that as a technical team. If there's any last-minute things that we need to take a look at, we should be prepared to do that then.
Yep, and we'll send you out the agenda for that. We'll be putting that together here pretty quickly, and we'll send that out to the tech committee as well, and if you have input on that, fire away.
Thanks. Well, it's a great piece of business. You got a date from Terry. That's terrific. Before we wrap up, we've covered a lot of stuff in the last 15 minutes. I want to open it up again. If there's any questions or comments on on what you've heard, anything that you're uncertain about what you might have heard, and we'll see if we can answer anything.
Hey, Mike, it's Sarah. I know, obviously, that we can share the annual report with whoever we want to when that's finalized, but is that RFP at a state where we can pass it along to people?
Well, I think I'd like to hear back from our folks in contracting, because they're going to use this RFP to design the grants.gov announcement, and I haven't heard back from them today yet. So if they have to tweak something that isn't right, I would just hold off a couple days until we get that finalized.
Okay.
So let me be even more specific than that. I think we need to wait until they tell us it's ready to be put out on grants.gov, because that's the mechanism. And I think what I would ask all of you to do is we'll tell you when that's there, and if you actually want a e-copy of the thing so you don't have to go look for it, because that is kind of an issue with grants.gov, we'll share that with everybody. And once we're there, then I would encourage you to send it out far and wide.
Yeah, and we had a couple of hiccups last year in the grants.gov process. We're going to tighten it up, and hopefully we'll not have as many problems this year. Anything else?
I could not find the link to the Ben and Ann and Johan's report on the website.
Ashley, can you help us with that?
Yeah, I sure can. We were actually waiting for the fact sheet that I referenced earlier to make it live. So I'm hoping, and I know Ann was going to get back to me within the next couple of days with that finalized version. So we haven't done the official launch of it. It's there, but it's not quite live yet.
Okay.
I found it. I just downloaded it. I'm emailing it out to our Habitat folks right now. I'm multitasking. I can send it to you, Kevin.
Okay. I'm obviously computer challenged then. That'd be great.
Yeah, it's not easy to find on the homepage since we haven't put the splash up there for the report yet.
Okay. Aaron, I was going to tell him to just upgrade his Atari and he'd be good to go.
Exactly. I was more of a Nintendo kid.
Okay, Kevin, before we hang up, anything you want to share?
Sure. I see what you're nudging. So just so folks know, I was offered a new position in the Fish and Wildlife Service in Denver, more or less doing landscape ecology across all the grassland and sagebrush ecosystems. And it just seemed like a pretty good fit, so I said yes. So I believe I'll be in this position for maybe a month more, and then I'll be transitioning duties to my new one in Denver.